It's fantastic to be here at National Endowment for Democracy. When I saw the lineup of speakers, I was just so delighted to be invited to be part of this. Today's session, we're going to look at security, human rights, and rule of law. We have three terrific panelists. Unfortunately, Idiat was not able to make it to today. So she was hyped up in the last session, but she's unfortunately not able to make it. We do have, and you have their bios, so I'm not going to go into great detail, Husseini Abdu from Plan International. He's country director for Plan International. We have Yemi Adamoleikum from executive director of Enough is Enough. And Kemi Odoladehin, or Kenyoda, I'm sorry, I can't even read my writing, Executive Director of Rule and Law and Empowerment Partners International. So just to maybe start out and frame the issue a little bit, last year, speaking at the annual conference of the Nigerian Bar Association, President Buhari proclaimed that, quote, the rule of law must be subject to the supremacy of the nation's security and national interests. The Bar Association was probably not the best audience to announce that in front of, but it's still worth, I think, thinking about this, challenging it, but also not getting too self-righteous about it. Every state and every country has kind of grappled with this balance in a time of new kinds of threats, transnational terrorism, suicide bombing, for example, the massive onslaught of disinformation, to kind of balance the two. But I mean, the question is, to what extent do you compromise rights in a way that does not undermine kind of your security and ultimately be counterproductive? And it's worth saying that there has been a real upsurge in violence in Nigeria over the past 10, 15 years, and different kinds of violence than previously in a way. You have the very localized conflicts, internal conflicts, transnational conflicts and networks, the Boko Haram and the Shekau faction, and now the Islamic State West Africa, operating in ways that Nigeria certainly, but much of the world has not been kind of fully equipped to respond to. You have the rise of vigilante groups. You have increasing violence and banditry in the Northwest. Of course, there's the increasing violence between herdsmen and farming communities that maybe some of you will talk about on the panel today. Still kidnappings, cult violence, gangs in the South. It's really a very kind of fractured and kind of pervasive, in a way, violence, in addition to police brutality and egregious abuses in certain cases by the military. All of this is fueled by some of the big structural causes: demography, resource competition, the increased flow of weaponry, increased illicit economies, but also I think the distance that has never been fully bridged between the Nigerian state, and that is at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, and the citizenry, and then also among Nigerians and among the communities. So this kind of social fabric, the social compact between state and citizenry, and the social fabric of connections among Nigerians has never fully been cemented. Corruption and abuse, the core of much of this, and is a catalyzer and a driver, have been corruption and abuse by the government. We heard a fair amount of this in the previous panel. When you have instances of rice intended for internally displaced people being sold off by local government authorities, when you have citizens detained in prison, alleged to be terrorists, but with no access to legal assistance or no charges dealt, when you have indiscriminate killings when the military comes into certain communities, The massacre of Shias a couple of years ago still remains, to my mind, a really unanswered abuse. If all of these kinds of, which we understand as helping drive this environment of violence and fracture, if all of these are unchecked by a judicial system and by a legal system, and we heard in the last panel how it's been weakened in certain ways, the government just becomes another player in all of this, and another kind of negative player that contributes to the violence. And when I say the government, there are many, many devoted public servants in the Nigerian government, and working often in very difficult circumstances. But again, it takes one egregious instance to set the project back. When the government becomes complicit like this, and I'm just going to end on this, tying back to the previous panel, one of the last recourses is a free press. And one of the great things about Nigeria, through all of these troubles in the last 20 years, to my mind, you can say it's a mess, it's corrupt, it's unequal, all of this stuff, but there's been this general sense of civil liberties and a free press that I think Nigeria has been proud of, a kind of a free society in many ways. And to my mind, the canary in the coal mine right now is the free press and the investigative press that is at the front lines of revealing stories, of investigating corruption. And when you start to see journalists arrested for insulting the president, for revealing facts, for revealing abuses by the military, that, to my mind, is a very disturbing trend in Nigeria. And so I just want to kind of emphasize that I've always kind of been a real strong optimist on Nigeria because there's a lot of good things happening in Nigeria. But this new trend, along with kind of the rising insecurity that's going to be very difficult to deal with, to my mind, are very troubling. So to speak about this, we have people eminently more qualified than I. We're going to start with Hussein Abdu, and we'll continue on. I'm a bit of a soft touch, but I've been told to be ruthless with my timekeeping so that you all can participate in the conversation. So don't take it personally if I cut you off, when you can come back to the point during Q&A. So Husseini.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I would like to approach these conversations historically and structurally without necessarily boxing ones down to the different dynamics of regime-based analysis. My sense is that the last 20 years has been quite difficult for the country in terms of security. We've seen, like you mentioned, a strong and huge escalating trend of insecurity in the country, and practically at one phase or the other. I think no segment of the country had historically, in the last 20 years, been immune to the level of insecurity. Probably now, the most pronounced is probably the situation in the northeast, Boko Haram, and the kidnapping and banditry in the northwest, and the herdsmen and the farmers' conflict in different other parts of the country, and to some extent the Niger Delta. Yes, these conflicts of violence contestations may have different expressions, but their escalating trends are also deeply associated with our history and the character or the security architecture of the country. Since the transition to civil rule in 1999, there hasn't been any significant shift in the security architecture in the country. Of all the conversations around reforms, I think the security architecture remains probably the only one that hadn't been touched in any way. Despite feeble attempts and that was made by Obasanjo in his first 4 years, the nature of the response to that hadn't changed. So response to security has remained deeply state-centered, and it's largely a government security agencies thing. It's regime-based, and the conception of security is more around how do you secure the regime or the power that be. It's largely militarist, driven mainly by the military. Practically, usurping the role of the police in so many levels. So there is practically no situation in the country today that does not have a military presence. You have military in practically all the states, performing one operation or the other. Practically all states of the country performing one operation or the other, and with different kinds of code names. They are overstretched, terribly unprofessional, and also lacking capacity to even deal with the challenges that they are experiencing. But the state hasn't been able to respond to this by actually trying to see how can we structurally respond to this crisis. So each layer of crisis had developed a different kinds of response. Some state-led, whether federal or state, some community-led in terms of self-help because of the level of helplessness that the people have actually found themselves. And that have had strong and implications on people's either collective, community, or individual political economy as this crisis begins to affect productions, particularly in the rural areas where insecurity had not allowed for the mainly agrarian communities to actually engage in their day-to-day livelihood activities. And so you have cases of internally displaced people across the length and breadth of the country. Probably the conversations in the public domain internationally is what you have in the Northeast in terms of internally displaced people. But there are a significant number of people displaced in the Northwest and the North Central part of the country, and even the Niger Delta and the Southeast. You still have that level of displacement. And so it's quite deeply challenging, but if we don't respond to the structural formation that defines the security architecture, I don't think, we always make reference to the fact that the structure hadn't changed since the military. But for me, probably it hasn't changed even since the colonial time. There hasn't been any significant, no change. It is a colonial structure that was still inherited by the military and by the military government, and the same that we are actually having today, not just in terms of formation, even in terms of the laws establishing then and the way the responsibilities are defined. A lot of those things are actually colonial. So the architecture is not responding to two things. One, is not responding to the changing dynamics of insecurity in the country. Two, it is not responding to the democratic imperatives around security and security management in the country. So that is the challenge, and that is what we need to respond to as a country.
Fantastic. And I would say it's not just the architecture, as you say, it's also kind of the conception of how do you do security. Yeah. And it's still kind of crush it out rather than think about some of the structural drivers. Thank you, that was great intervention. We're going to turn to Kemi next.
Okay. I'll start from where Hussaini has stopped. So if you look at the security challenges, there's certain issues or certain things that have cropped up that we see now. One of it would be the effect or the emerging trends of sexual gender-based violence. So sex being used as a weapon of war. And we see this with rape in the Northeast and victims of insurgency as victims of sexual gender-based violence. And not only by the insurgents, you also see uniformed personnel also being accused, allegations of them raping women and girls. And the response to it by the state, what we've seen is mainly driven through the lens of public safety, and you're looking at response of reporting, victims reporting the perpetrators, which most times difficult to report, difficult to investigate, difficult to follow through. But we miss the lens of looking at SGBV now through the lens of public health, and addressing it from the lens of public health allows us to look at it maybe more in a social or humane manner that gives respite or gives some form of succor to the victim. Because when you're looking at it through the lens of the public safety, rights of the victims continuously being eroded because justice doesn't come, so to say. Then there's the element of cultism, the emerging trends of cultism across, mainly in the Southwest. And I'll say not really mainly in the Southwest, but we tend to say mainly in the Southwest. And I've had discussions with colleagues, and with particularly in Lagos now, where there's an ongoing campaign against cultism. And my colleagues working on on the NPP have had discussions with the traditional rulers, and they're asking, is cultism a crime? And for those of us that are Nigerians would understand where they're coming from, because there's a traditional secret cult system that protects the traditional institution. And I mean, it gets you thinking, and you ask yourself that really, is cultism a crime in the country? And I'm forced to say no, because the Constitution guarantees freedom of association. But then what we tend to tell them is activities that you perform under the guise of having an association that is contrary to the law is a crime, irrespective of the platform in which you are engaging. And on moving the discussion around cultism a bit further, is that I think a couple of years back when I was at Clean, and we conducted a research into informal policing groups, and basically looking a bit into cultism, some sort, on the non-state actors. You couldn't really see a trend of groups that were women-led or women-driven under these sectors. But in recent times, you've seen the emergence of cult groups that are women-led, women-driven. And what you find with them is that they're mainly more daring and more vicious than the male-dominated groups. And it's most likely in a bid to affirm and to enforce that, yes, we can. And so because, yes, we can, yes, we're women, but we can also engage within the space, they tend to go a bit more overboard. However, it's not an area that we want to think of or we want to acknowledge, because in our human mind, women are not supposed to be found engaging in this kind of space. So when you have discussions around, I'm linking it out to the women, peace and security activities in country, is that women are mainly seen as victims, and we are under the radar as perpetrators, or active participants. And if you link it also to the Northeast, I have this lovely illustration that within the security and law enforcement agencies, particularly the military, it took a long time. When you're talking gender mainstreaming, women in combatant positions, there were so many arguments against it. Women are not set up to be combatants. The law or their process does not allow it, blah, 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 blah. However, when Boko Haram evolved, and being in the north, and the mechanism or the technique of moving arms with hijab, and you're in a place where men cannot frisk women, then they needed to respond to that. And in responding to it, we had women being recruited and being posted to the forefront. So part of the good things that have evolved, so to say, is that mainstreaming women or mainstreaming women into operational positions in the military, in the police, and across the security agencies has evolved. It took a negative event, but brought out a positive thing. And for us to roll back would be a bit difficult. And still pushing the women dimension now, and before I'm cut off, is looking at women participation in politics. And also looking at it through the lens of the WPS, Women, Peace and Security Architecture. Is the thinking that anything women should be driven by the Ministry of Women Affairs. And I think that's part of the challenge that we're having. The Women Affairs Ministry is not really set up to drive certain things. They could be facilitators, but to have the burden or the responsibility of driving with issues relating to women only through the Ministry of Women Affairs, I think is something that it's a trend that has emerged, and it's a trend that I think we need to address if we're going to get it right. And I'll link it to the security, law enforcement and security agencies, for example. Their responsibilities under the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan for the law enforcement and security agencies as per their participation, under Pillar 2, which deals with participation under the WPS framework. I do not see the Ministry of Women Affairs having that capacity to be able to convey the security agencies to do what is needful under the National Action Plan. However, if the National Action Plan is disconstructed and we have a scenario where we start having like a sector-wide approach to engagement, we most likely would be moving towards a better place. So in summary, I'm saying let's move away from 20 years. Some of us were not there, as Samson said, when when we were in the streets, but we've heard the stories, we've seen where we're coming from, we see where we are at, and that the silos approach of certain activities we need to move away from it and see how we mainstream more broadly and see how that is more embedded within the system.
Great. Thank you so much, Kemi. And with that, we'll turn to Yemi, and I will follow up with a couple of questions before we open it up, because there's plenty to discuss here.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry. Right, thank you. So yeah, also wasn't there 20 years ago. And I think for me what's interesting is that with the success, if I want to use that quote loosely, that our democracy has brought, as was noted earlier, it's also brought with it the challenges. So if I, for example, link what Hussein said with what Kemi said, security architecture, and within that you have military personnel walking away off duty. You have the Wall Street Journal writing a report of military mass graves for military that the government denied, but then stopped short of that. So they denied it, but then didn't start an investigation, didn't try to find out where were the grave sites, where did you get the story, who was buried, and that tells you quite a bit. You have security personnel complaining of their welfare, not being paid salaries, and protesting to that effect. And so you have people like that who are meant to be protecting citizens. As Husseini said as well, you have military personnel who are meant to protect us from external threats, actually actively working inside and being stretched. Then you go to gender-based violence, and also our people who are meant to protect women in camps are also being accused. But what's underlining both of those things is just a lack of accountability and impunity. And I think for me that then takes it sort of to sort of the role of citizens and how that then plays up. Because you then have a situation where citizens don't feel like they matter. There's impunity, there's a lack of accountability, get kidnapped, people get killed, and nothing happens. Your president doesn't speak, your governor doesn't speak, there's no investigation. Samson spoke earlier about Fisayo's story, and he went undercover, brought with evidence, he had clips, he had pictures of what was happening in the prisons. And the response is not that the police nor the prison service have had a press conference, have addressed anything, issued any statement of any investigation of the crime and the clear violation of laws that Fisayo brought out. But what we woke up to this morning was Fisayo being afraid for his life and now going into hiding. So I think for me, from the institutions that we have to how citizens feel about the nation state and how they fit into this whole structure is what I find very interesting in our parallel between a military regime and a democracy. So under the military regime, you're quite clear that the government doesn't really care about you. Shoot you today, nothing happens. But people protested, people fought, and I mean generally, let's also be clear that globally, that's where sort of the trend was. So it was also in the interest of outside powers that we also become a democracy. So we fought with outside help, if I want to use that phrase. But the difference with democracy is supposed to be that the citizen and the rights of the citizens is at the center of this game, is at the center of this form of government. It's what we want. We engage with our representative. So the dynamics should be different. We should matter. Government should care about us. And that, for me, is what the challenge of this our democracy is. Because under military, it's clear that you don't matter. So you're not under any illusion. But under a democracy, you should matter. And then you kind of don't. And then it's a bit of a problem. But what I also find very interesting is how it's very difficult in this Nigeria to organize. So we talked about 20 years ago and the organization that got us to where we are now. The organization that got, I mean, Samson alluded to it, in 2010 when Yar'Adua was sick. Yes, young people were, but young people followed, as Ms. Obey said, the footprints of older people who were also on the street and speaking, in a sense, in the same voice. But under a democracy, interests are divided. The voices are not just as strong. And earlier we also talked about the difference between the federal government level and sort of subnationals. It's much easier dealing with federal level issues because voices are amplified from Katsina to Lagos, from Cross River to Kano. But if I'm shouting about what's happening in Cross River, if you're in Katsina, you really don't care. So voices are much, in a sense, lower. Samson went through the spectrum of people who are being victimized at different levels, at different state levels. So I think the challenge therein is how does a citizen find itself, how does it place itself in the midst of all of this? Social media has been absolutely fantastic, in my opinion, because it's given citizens voice. It's given them a platform to speak, either directly or anonymously. And it's also interesting how governors responded to that, because a Facebook post gets you arrested just because you said your governor is kind of stupid. Or you said your governor didn't account for resources. That gets you arrested. Or, I mean, one of Showere's charges is that he insulted the president. Yeah, he should be insulted. You're a public figure. I don't see why you might not like it, but it's not a reason to put me in jail. Or people get picked up. I mean, Showere was abducted. There was a whole big issue about was he arrested or was he abducted? Well, the security agency that picked him up has no rights, has no powers by law to arrest. They picked him up at night. There were no charges, kept him for 48 hours, no access to lawyers. I'll call that an abduction, not an arrest. And then his charges came maybe 50 days later. So therein lies the environment. But then, as also had been noted, is the lack of connection in organizing of citizens in articulating a sort of a unified position. Therefore, government feels that they can do and get away with it because, yeah, people will whimper a little bit and then we'll kind of move on and we're where we are.
Thank you. Really interesting set of interventions, all kind of connected in that way. Before I open up, maybe I'll just ask Hussaini first. In terms of kind of reforming this architecture, and we're talking just about the security services, let's say. I mean, what might be your priority steps, and how might you begin to galvanize that process?
One, I think the priority, there are two dimensions to it, or rather three. One is the larger institutional dimensions in terms of having a clear delineations and definitions, roles and responsibilities as provided by law and the Constitution. Second is about the internal reforms within each of these institutions, whether it is the military, or it is the police, or it is the state security service, that actually need the proper reforms. And these reforms are not simply around the processes of recruitment, but about trainings, about responsibilities, about understanding right and operations within the democratic setting. And then the third, for me, the third dimension of it is about the coordinations and relationship between these different institutions of the state. And recognizing that the whole essence of their establishment is about the protection and the safety and the security of the citizens of the country, and therefore they are not above the citizens. And the other dimension for me is about how we can subject these very important institutions to civil control and governance. And I think that has been the major challenge, that the military had, as an institution, I'm just taking that as an example, had operated independent of the system. It's practically above, even to some extent, above the executive, the way it operates. And if I use the operation in the Northeast as an example, or one of the operations in the Southeast about 2 years now ago, the mode of operation is such that it's totally devoid of what you mentioned, accountability. Accountability to nobody. And we saw that example even with Obasanjo in power, with the situation in Zaki Bian and Odi, and what happened, and nobody had been held responsible for that up to today. And that's probably also informed what we saw in the southeast, and the clamp down on the airport people, and all the massacres that have taken place. And a lot of these massacres take place, sometimes reported, sometimes unreported. So there is totally no accountability. And I think as we relate this to rule of law, the challenge is that we had a transition, surely, to civil rule, but there hasn't been any fundamental change in the political culture of the country, whether particularly from the political leaders. There's no that change. The understanding of governance and leadership is still militarist. It is the same approach that sole administrators use at the state level that today governors are using. That's their example. That is why someone mentioned that in the earlier panel about security vote. It was a system that was instituted during military rule. In fact, the military even had a better accountability mechanisms for security vote. I studied that, and I knew that, because internally they have their guidelines that manage that. State budgets were approved, as bad as it was, but state budgets were approved by the armed forces or the provisional ruling council, and then they come back, decisions were taken by the state executive council, commissioners were civilians, but there's a guideline on how that was managed. But today, totally, you don't have that. So the attitude of our political leaders from the center, the presidential level, down through the governors and local government chairmen, is that military approach to leadership. And that's a reorientation that we need to have. When Obasanjo instituted that, the approach to his reform was rather depoliticizing the military, which is not bad in itself. But depoliticizing the military does not necessarily mean weeding out those that are seen to be political, or weeding them out alone. That may be just one of them, one of those mechanisms that you probably use. But it's not the only way that you can manage such a situation. So I think this is a big challenge that we're dealing with. These are the kind of changes we need to bring in. Something to the police. One of the major issues of the police now in the country is the contention between the Police Service Commission and the Inspector General of Police, who recruits, who handle recruitments, who manage promotion, and there's a mass recruitment taking place. And there's a big contention, and it's been a mess in the last 2 months between these, and nothing has actually been done. So it's just a clear reflection. But we don't, one thing we need to recognize that almost every government since they returned to civil rule in 1999 had instituted one form of reform of the police or the order or a panel to investigate what changes are needed in the form. And we've had them in the police. There are about 5 different reports from the Nigerian police. In fact, Obasanjo had 2, him alone. Eradua has 1.5. And we have all those reports laying there. Buhari didn't even touch that one. I think he's totally not even interested in that. So we need to have a much more robust, comprehensive approach to it, and this also have to relate with the structure of even the federation itself. The conversation: what happened to state police? Should we still be operating as a country, as a federation, based on a single police structure? And that's a major conversation in the country. And with what we are seeing is that state governments have instituted one form of police structure or the other without necessarily calling it the police. You go there, in Kano you have Karota, for instance, in Kaduna you have it, you have LASMA in Lagos. So there are different kinds of policing institutions that state governments have established without necessarily calling it police. But if we have that already, it means that we are having some much more, not through a formal process, but we're having a gradual changes in that structure. And so why can't we just harmonize it and have a clear position as a federation?
Interesting, yeah. It kind of goes a bit to the point of who's the constituency that pushes this with enough force to make a difference. And this idea of the kind of fractured of civil society or fragmented, and there is competition among civil society groups. You're going after similar pots, and I do think there have been a lot more collaborations in the last 15 years. I mean, certainly around the elections, the coalitions of civil society groups that comes together have been really, really encouraging. But I wonder if you might speak about kind of building constituencies for these big issues. How do you connect the Katsina with the Cross Rivers, sort of?
I think for me, it's I think for me, it's actually less formal organizations as civil society. I think civil society, I mean, I work in one, and they play their roles, but ultimately I think to get the shift that we need, citizens need to be more engaged. And what we've seen is from sort of the movement building of what brought us to democracy, it's a sort of abdication of responsibility to organizations. So people will call Kemi like, oh, what are we going to do about this? Or call me or call Samson. So it's that you people do this thing, so what are we going to do about it? And what is next that you are going to do? And I think really it's getting citizens to understand how the dynamics should be different. Now, one, it's given that it's not taught. So, I mean, it's one excuse me, it's one of the things that I struggled with coming into the space. It's basically like, okay, the road is bad, the schools are crap, there's no medicine in the clinic. This is the elected official, it's his responsibility, let's have a conversation with him. It was that sort of, in my head, it was that logical. But in just engaging people, I just realized it's actually not quite that logical, just because there are 20 gazillion other things to worry about. And in the process, that whole holding that person accountable is just really far off. And it's a process that we must be committed to and understand that until citizens understand what this whole thing means and how it affects their quality of life and their aspirations, then will they take action to improve that? So it's just a lot of work. It's just a lot of work in educating. It's a lot of work in consensus building, movement building, because ultimately what politicians respond to are numbers, and those are voting numbers, or numbers enough that threaten whatever it is that they're about. And we've seen it in different contexts when there is a perceived interest, either positive or negative, that there is a response. But I think part of the challenge in that process is just the seemingly difficulty in sort of the challenges of living, if I want to use that word, like
bread
sort of
and butter,
exactly,
immediate issues versus
exactly.
who's thinking
sort
about
of bring it larger things. So
security sector reform.
exactly, or even just very simple. It doesn't even have to be as big as security sector reform. It's just really as basic as healthcare, or things that are even directly beneficial to you. How do you help people see the direct correlation and do the bit of work that's required so it's not abdicated to others to do? And our sort of religious dependency doesn't help either. I mean, I can't speak for Islam, but I'll speak for Christianity a lot because that's what I know. The default mode is just that God will just miraculously just sort everything out and we'll all be okay. Hallelujah. So that doesn't help either. So there's that. So you abdicate to civil society, abdicate to God, and just deal with life.
It's interesting. I was recently at a conference that had a number of Nigerians, including 2 Nigerian governors, who were kind of grappling with how do you deliver for the immediate needs of people, like, get school fees for a kid to go to school, versus the bigger systemic problems that they don't get, that may take a longer time, so you don't get the immediate benefit of that. Now, I don't know, that's what they were saying. I don't know how they're doing that in practice, but it is a dilemma in a democracy to how do you meet the immediate needs while also kind of trying to make the case for these bigger systemic reforms, whether it's education, health, security, and so forth.
But the signs are always there. I think, I believe that you can see signs of people who are trying to, anybody who's in office who's trying to merge that in sort of their approach, language, things that they prioritize in communication and signs that they give off. Yes, you can't do everything.
You have to make the case.
Exactly.
And then the strategic communication is not always a forte of these governments, too.
There we go.
I wondered if you might just say a few words about kind of the women's movement broadly. Have we seen you look at some of the legislature on violence against women, still a huge amount of kind of conservatism in those. And I'm just wondering, are we seeing, you're looking back 20 years, has there been progress? What would you say are the benchmarks of progress, or what would be, where might the progress first come?
I'll say that it's at different levels. So I'll pick it at 3 different levels. So if you say broadly within civil society, do we have a women's movement within the country? I'll say yes. It might not be as formal as you have an NGO that is like a network of women, but you have platforms that bring women together, that is creating an opportunity for us to kind of not work in silos, have a safe space to think out issues and determine strategies for engagement. So there are multiple platforms like that. And even within within those platforms, there are generational gaps, and maybe an attempt being made to breach the generational gaps. And of course, because there are generational gaps, our approach and the way we think things should be done are totally different. Then if you look at it, if we now look at it within the country, looking at the legal framework, yes, we have new laws that attempts at protecting women. One of such is the Violence Against Person Prohibition Act. We have a national gender policy. I've made reference to Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan version 2. However, has that translated into anything tangible? I'll say no. No under this administration. Because under this present administration, either consciously, I deliberately use consciously or unconsciously, either deliberately or unintentionally, there has been a rollback on some of the gains that were made. In the political space, I'll leave that to Muibat. When she comes up, she'll say enough about that. But within the public safety security space, I'll give a good example. I'll give one example. In Abuja recently, some months back, we had the joint task force picking up young women on the streets under the guise of cleaning the streets of prostitutes, clearing prostitutes off the streets of Abuja. And the question you ask yourself is, number one, how do you know a prostitute? It's not written on anybody's head. Number two, who says that only women prostitute? And how do you pick somebody for a crime of prostitution without the person soliciting? I mean, that's a crime that is so difficult to prove. But we had that in country 2019, not 20 years ago. And there were push from civil society groups to the police, the joint task, because the joint task force is made up of practically all of them are there: police, military, air force, navy, you name it, they're all part of the joint task force. And I think NHRC this week or last week inaugurated a committee that is supposed to look at these allegations and come up with recommendations. One of the things we've said that we think might work, and suggestion that maybe have a women security network or women peace and security network or something, but not what we've seen casually, something similar to WIMBYs, women in business. That is practical, that is more engaging, and let's see how this, level of activity would also help in moving forward. Then out finally, looking at it through the lens of the security agencies, reflection of women within personnel of the security agencies, I think it's low and could be better. So the issue of having targeted recruitment to get more women into the security agencies and also provide opportunities for them to move across the cadre and into positions of responsibility. 2019, preparing for 2019 general elections, we decided, okay, let's have a planning session for ops, for the operational team of the police. And at the back of our mind, we said we're a women-led organization, but it never occurred to us that you should pointedly ask for women participation. And so when we got into the hall, and it was DC Ops, Deputy Commissioner of Police Operations across the 36 states, including FCT, there was no woman in that room. None at all. They had colleagues from DSS in the space, no female representation. So it bothers one, and we now had another smaller convening with the agencies that represented on the Interconsultative Committee on Election Security, and looking at planning and how you integrate women issues into planning from the point of planning to delivery. Because we connect Pillar 2 and Pillar 3, Pillar 2 participation, Pillar 3 protection. And our theory is if you do not participate, there's no way you can protect, And certain things happened during the 2019 elections. There were issues of sexual gender-based violence also on the part of officials that were deployed for the elections. And one of the things I raised with colleagues, particularly police, when we were debriefing, was you left your female officers out of the planning process. So nobody came thinking through the lens that, what if this happened? What if it's the assumptions that lead the planning? So there was nothing put in place to protect. And so when it happened, you tried to cover it up. But the issue is there, and then the female officers feel vulnerable and are reluctant to take up certain assignments because there's no framework for protection.
Yeah. Okay, on that note, let's open it up for some questions. I think we'll take 4 at a time. We'll be ambitious. Take 2 from here, 2 from here. And then if you have it, if it's to a particular person, please say that, and please do try to keep it short. Go with the gentleman there first.
Okay. My name is Chuck Onya from School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution. I'm talking about security. We know that in the last 20 years of our democracy, insecurity has been a major challenge in Nigeria. In fact, the situation in Nigeria now rivals what we had during the military junta in Nigeria. And that led to the proliferation of some kind of informal security structures in Nigeria. For example, in Kano, we have the Hisba, and in northern Nigeria, we know how the civilian JTF was eventually put together to join the military. Now, a major challenge we have is that after arming such organizations, what are the mechanisms we have in place to ensure that in future, these groups will not constitute security threat and challenge to the whole country? How do we mop up arms from these organizations? Thank you.
Great question. The lady here.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. My name is Rachel. I'm a graduate student at American University. And I think my question is for Kemi. You talked earlier about prostitution. Sorry?
Kemi, Yemi.
We have Yemi and
Yeah.
Kemi. It's confusing.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. But you talked earlier about prostitution and like how that affects women's safety. Do you think Nigeria is ready for a situation where there's a legalization of sex work? Because that also, if there's a framework that, you know, protects women, it does help in keeping people accountable. And do you think Nigeria is ready for something like that? Thank you.
Thank you. The lady here, right there.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for this panel. My name is Samantha Tate. I'm with the Solidarity Center. We work with trade unions, and I just wanted to note that we did try to work with the organizers to bring a representative from the Nigerian Labor Congress to participate here, because trade unions are actually one of the largest, most inclusive forms of civil society, organized civil society in Nigeria. I know that we could have a debate around you know, the challenges that they face, but I wanted to note that they've been able to advance on some of the challenges that the folks up on the panel are mentioning, including in the peace building process. You know, healthcare workers, teachers are organized in unions and have been a part of addressing some of the issues that you've talked about in the Northeast, in Borno in particular. They're part of tax justice and good governance networks, trade unions alongside other types of civil society organizations that are citizen members. To your point about, you know, you need to involve and educate and lift up organized civil society, not from union or from organizations top down, but also through education and mobilization. And most recently in the minimum wage struggle, I think organized civil society through unions is one of the organizations that's been able to actually get government to work in terms of, you know, putting forward a collective proposal and making policy happen. We'll see what happens with it in an inflationary kind of setting. But so my question really is related to the point that Kemi, I believe, made, Yemi made, that organizing today in Nigeria is difficult, right? And so my question around that is I'm not talking just about organizing workers, but organizing in general and independent civil society organizations. What we've seen from the Solidarity Center is that there's government interference now, co-optation, creation of parallel unions. And so I don't know if that's happening in other parts of organized civil society, whether it's NGOs or other women's organizations. And so my question to the panel and whoever wants to respond is, you know, is that something that's happening, that you observe a form of co-optation, a form of parallelism, as a kind of disturbance and way of clamping down on free expression and freedom of association?
Great. Sudan is a good example of the parallelization in unions and the power of unions in terms of changing government. the gentleman here, and then we'll have another round to come back.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. My name is Joseph Haley. I'm a ACLS Mellon Fellow at the World Justice Project. And I wanted to start by issuing a kind of general invitation. We're focusing over the next 6 months or so on the West African Sahel, and particularly access to justice issues in the West African Sahel. And we're actively looking for partners to help us understand kind of how that access to justice piece of the puzzle fits into the overall security situation. So anyone who wants to find me at the break and chat about that, please do. But my question is actually a bigger picture question. In the process of preparing our 2019 index, it's becoming increasingly clear that a lot of the trends that you're describing today are not limited to Nigeria by any means, but this is actually a global phenomenon of backsliding. I think it'll be really interesting to see, even in the United States, how the rule of law picture shakes out in our 2019 report.
Let's not go there.
Yeah, but my general question is, to what extent can the phenomena that you're describing be attributed to kind of the return of history, right, or kind of bigger picture, regional or continental or even global phenomena impinging upon the rule of law in Nigeria?
Okay, great. Okay, Husseini, maybe you can take on the vigilante question, and then we have the commercial sex work question. We have the power of unions, and then for anyone who would like to respond to kind of Nigeria within the broader global trend of kind of slight rollback on rule of law, democracy, and so forth.
Okay, yeah, okay, thank you very much. I think, yes, it's true, as the security situation in the country escalates, we have seen increasingly the involvement of vigilante or vigilantism, as is described. But it is not all these non-conventional security structures or institutions that are actually informal. A lot of them were established by law, enacted by state assemblies. Not all of them are armed. The Hizbah you mentioned in particular is a product, the product of the institutionalization of Sharia in the early 2000s in most states in the northern part of the country. And each of those states that have enacted Sharia law had cause to also establish Hizbah to monitor sort of implementations of the Sharia law. They are not armed in that sense, but probably maybe what you are referring to is the civilian task force that you had in the northeast. It's a major issue, and for me personally, it's a major concern, and I believe that the country is toying with a very dangerous situation, which I honestly believe that it will boomerang. A lot of these people hadn't been properly trained, but they've been armed in different kinds of arms and working actually side by side with the military in the bush, and in some cases actually they lead it in terms of penetrating some of these difficult, less accessible rural communities in Borno State in particular. And some of them have become very violent, and they have also become major beneficiaries of the new war economy, and therefore demobilizations can become challenging even if the crisis ends today. I'm also aware that there were situations also in the past where some of them were trained and absorbed into the military. But again, considering the configuration of the country and the process of recruitment that is actually based on quota per state, on state-by-state basis, it has the potential to also create a different narratives that could also have strong implications for national cohesion. So it's a big situation, and I don't think that there is anything on ground at the moment that describe and say if this thing ends, this is how we are going to manage the situation. And there are many countries that have experienced that. We saw that situation in Sierra Leone. We saw it in Liberia. And it's been a major issue all over, even in Sudan, both the Northern Sudan and the South Sudan, the situation in Congo. So there are several examples where vigilantes have been used for this kind of wars, and eventually when it ends, it becomes a big problem to the country. So I'm not surprised. Can I make a quick comment on polarization of the union?
Okay, let's make these quite quick because we do want
that's
to try to get
yes,
another one.
polarization is going on, no doubt about it. We saw it actually during Obasanjo's regime, and when the NRC, when they liberalized, to use their word, of the trade union, and from NRC we had the Trade Union Congress emerging, and now ASU, Academic Staff Union of Universities. We also have a different university body that is now seeking for registration as a different body within, as a union within the university system. It's the first time it is happening in recent time, and from the comment of the Minister of Labor, it seems that the government is excited about it, and they may probably get registered soon.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Yeah, just to add to that definitely so. And I think one of the things that we see more clearly is during protest. So you have counter-protests that are funded by government. And during elections, you have civil society organizations as observers that are also funded by government. So that's very much a part of it. But I think to your point about the success of trade unions with salaries, I mean, 18,000, which was the minimum wage, was $120. The 30,000 that they've negotiated to is about $83. So in sort of real terms, not much of a difference. But more importantly, it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier around restructuring, around the fact that Nigeria, it doesn't make any sense, quite frankly, for Nigeria to have a uniform minimum wage from Lagos to Katsina. And sort of the ability of the unions to have that conversation either before an election and the ability to shut down operations, which is quite strategic, is really the issue that we haven't quite addressed. And in the framing of restructuring, yes, I mean, without even a national conference, you can have pockets of parts of the country who, if they want to work as regions together in terms of economic development, do that. And none of the regions have been able to pull that off, even in the Southwest, that are probably one of the loudest proponents of restructuring and regionalism, even within their regional body, the Dawn Commission. They haven't done anything with it in, I don't know, 8 years or so that it's been in existence. So interesting dynamics.
Okay. First, I'll say something on the non-state actors. First is to say that right now we're in discussion around community policing in country. And the police are saying that they're going to recruit 40,000 special constabulary. Special constabularies are going to be nominated by the traditional rulers, I think, at the local government level. And part of some of the issues that some of us have asked is, how do you identify, who these people would be? And if we haven't been in the space for a while, one of the things that would most likely come up is that those that have been active within community structures, community safety structures, would most likely get nominated. And we know that some of them will be members of these vigilante groups. So you're finding a scenario where there is some form of legitimization that would take place. Secondly is that I totally agree with Hussaini. We can't lump all of them together. You need to understand the way they have evolved and how they operate. So CJTF is totally different from HISBA. And to also stress that within the HISBA, that because some of us from the South do not understand it, that HISBA has a women's wing, right? So you have a women's wing within HISBA that addresses women's issues. And you don't see that within the formal security apparatus. So you find state apparatus, yes, some of them have state edicts, but there's no standard within the states for determining how they set up these mechanisms, which is the cause for concern, which is something we should look at. But when you talk community policing is now an open gate also to look at the activities of vigilante groups or non-state security actors. And that brings us to the question of our security architecture. Should we continue deceiving ourselves that these groups do not have a role to play? Or we ask ourselves and determine that they have a role to play and then sit down and craft the space for them to play the role? Because if we're going to do recruitment, what we keep saying is that we don't have enough police officers to cover the space. Are we going to recruit enough to cover the space? Do we have the resources to, even if we recruit, to train and equip and maintain? The answer is no. So we need to look at another way of addressing this. Then prostitution. Is Nigeria ready for legalization of sex workers? I'll say no. The reason being that we are very pretentious as per morality, and we still continue to look at commercial sex work through public safety lens. If we look at it through public health, the discussion will be different. And legalization or oversight or accountability, call it whatever name we want to call it, regulation would be easier. And even the ladies and the men that are in the trade would come out openly and would also embrace the process.
Thank you. Chris, how are we on time? One more round. Just on the CJT, if I may, I'm glad you came back with that, because there is a tendency, particularly in this country, to demonize vigilantism. We have a terrible history in that. But the fact is, if you talk to citizens in Maiduguri, they say, you know, this was the turning point when they became the eyes and ears for the military. And yes, there have been abuses, and CJTF leaders recognize the dangers that a lot of young men who have been empowered pose. Like you said, let's drop the pretension that this is just a bad thing that, you know, we don't need. They actually grew because there was nobody else protecting their communities. And I think your point on how do we create a space, mechanisms of accountability, and kind of addressing this systemically is really important one. 2 more questions, did you say? The lady here, and then the lady there.
Hi, thanks so much for speaking with us today. My name's Crystal Famba. I'm a legal fellow with RFK Human Rights. So Yemi, you just mentioned previously about Omoyele Sowore, who's recently been detained for the last 3 months arbitrarily by DSS and the Nigerian government. Part of his detention is for organizing a protest and insulting the president, a series of arbitrary offenses under Cybercrime 2015 law, and detaining him for 45 days under a terrorism act. And we're seeing through Africa, through the lens of security processes, that where the governments are restricting civic space, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. In Chad, Togo, Benin, all these places where internet shutdowns and all kinds of restrictions on civic space are going on under the lens of security. So it's kind of a broad question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how there can be an emphasis on security and threats from all parts of the region, while also ensuring civic space, freedom of expression, freedom to protest, and things of which are excessively necessary in a true democracy.
Thank you. And then across the aisle. And we'll try to make responses brief. You can wrap your remarks up.
Thank you. My name is Loretha, and I'm a graduate student at the George Washington University. My question is to Kemi. You talked about addressing sexual gender-based violence through the lens of public health and mental health, and you also talked about addressing sex workers through that same lens. And I'm thinking, would you say that the Nigerian health sector is ready for that kind of change? Do you think that we have the resources and the ideology and the time to actually, do you think that the health center, the mental health sector in Nigeria is ready for such change?
Great. Good. Shall we just come along? You can answer the question you wish, and wrap up quite quickly because we stand between lunch and this audience.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask a question earlier, and to what extent would what is happening in Nigeria also be associated with a global, is it a global trends or something like that, which I think none of us responded to that. And I have this tentative argument that I make about saying that, look, Nigeria transited to democracy at the peak of the triumphalism of liberal democracy, just at that peak. And the peak also happens to be another phase, the next phase of a recession that we are also experiencing around the world, without excusing some of the irresponsibilities of the state in Nigeria. It is also clear that it could find some parties around the world to associate with. It could easily find justifications or rationalizations based on examples of certain countries or some other places. So I wouldn't be surprised about that. It's not to excuse anybody, but the truth is, my sense is that dimension is there, particularly when you have conversations with some of those politicians who are very quick to remind you, oh, what about this country? Why are you talking about this? What about that country? And all that. And then quickly on the mental health, and I'm sure that question is meant for Kemi. But there's, I want to share something very quickly. There have been a very disturbing trend in northern Nigeria very recently, particularly in the last 1 month, which is about the identifications of different rehabilitation centers, which most often in the media, the popular media in the country is often referred to as Almajiri schools. They are actually not Almajiri schools. They were rehabilitation centers instituted by Muslim scholars who think that they could use the Islamic means of rehabilitating people with mental health challenges. And they keep them in a very despicable situations. They are chained, they are kept in a very terrible condition. There were 2 identified in Katsina. As of yesterday, there were 3 of them in Kaduna now. There is one in Kano, and the numbers we are talking about in total are running into thousands, and of different age, actually, from children to adults of up to 40, 50 years old, male and female. So there's a very huge mental health crisis in the country, and the system is currently incapable of responding to it.
Thank you.
To your question, the Cybercrime Act, which is actually it's been challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court because of its vagueness and the ability of it to be misused as it's currently being used, does pose a challenge. But I think fundamentally it goes back to what we started with around the balance between rule of law and security. I personally don't believe that the fears around security are grounded in any real fact. Yele would have had his protest on August 5th. People will have come out. People will have gone home. We'll be done. So I think the guys, his phones could have, if DSS wanted to tap his phone and track him and monitor him because they were concerned, they could easily have done that. But rather they pick him up, ask for 90 days to investigate someone you've already picked up. Don't you pick people up when they've already committed a crime? So you ask for 90 days, you get 45 days, then decide you want another 20 days, but in between the Attorney General of the Federation says, okay, now we're going to charge you with this. So for me, I personally don't believe that security is the issue. I think security is a guise to shrink and to compress civic space. And you can see it in both laws like the Cybercrime Act and also in the way politicians react to people who criticize them, which is why you pick people up for asking you how you spend money, which is why you're trying to pass a bill that says, a social media bill that clamps that, which is why you're trying to regulate internet, regulate online platforms, newspapers and online TV stations, because they don't go through and our commission that monitors what you can say on air. So I think really it's about restricting what people say and the ability of citizens to actually organize and speak freely and challenge people in positions of authority. So that will continue as long as those in authority are afraid of what citizens can and will do and should do. And I think the only response is actually for citizens to sort of literally hunker down on that space and own it and keep it. And I think, I'm speaking for Nigeria emphatically, but I think it applies, I would say, quite the same across the continent.
Okay, finally, Ken.
Yes. Is the public health space in country ready? Just like the security sector space is grappling with challenges, same with the public health space in the country. But then again, I would say that this is something I usually like saying, that even if a sector is well equipped to deal with what it's supposed to do, it cuts across every other thing. There's no need to make special provisions for any group of people. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? So if the public sector is well equipped, we have trained officials, we have facilities, we have drugs, we have we have the appropriate allocation. It doesn't matter if you are commercial sex worker, if you're a victim of sexual gender-based violence. It doesn't matter if you're a mother a woman in labor from anywhere, any part of the country. The system is there to cater for you. So in short, I'm saying pay attention to the system and let the system accommodate this. Just the way we're saying pay attention to the security system and let it accommodate this. I would be careful in saying that they need mental support.
Well, sexual-based violence victims, I think.
Yes, not the commercial sex workers.
No, I think you meant the SGB.
But if it's for the SGBV victims, yes, there is need for mental kind of trauma support. However, like Hussaini has said, that's an emerging trend in the country, and we pride ourselves in being strong and resilient, but suicide is emerging, and we're seeing it across the universities and among young people, and we're asking ourselves, where did we go wrong? It's now a debate. It's something that is being flagged, that we're having discussions around depression and coping with stress. These are things that have just emerged, So I think Nigeria is also facing some of these emerging issues. And SGBV, yes, I think we tried a SAC. There was an attempt there are attempts at setting up sexual assault referral centers in the country. It was initially supported by the British Council Project programs, Justice for All. And what you have, and the best example of the SAC that I would give any day, anytime, is the Mirabel Center in Lagos. So it's a one-stop shop center. You have the psychologist, you have the doctors, you have access to legal support, you have access to the police at the Mirabel Center. And so this is something that has been piloted and it's working. So it means that it can work. But I'll quickly say the difference between the Mirabel Center and the other centers that exist is the capacity of Partnership for Justice to support Mirabel. So you've seen other groups trying to support SACs in other parts of the country. It's not working because they don't have the capacity. So it's not just enough for you to be a women's rights group and then you support a SAC. You must have that technical capacity and the know-how to provide the support.
Great, thank you very much. I think that interface between security and public health, whether it's drug use, whether it's sexual-based violence, that's the one to sensitize on both sides. Listen, we're at time. Once again, I've done very badly on the time management, but it was a terrific panel, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers today. Thank you, that was great.